you don't have a compelling reason why you're trying to tackle something different, all the training in the world and all the preparation in the world that you have to do to develop a peak performance mindset is all a moot point. So I think that was first and foremost. I had to really zero in on why I was doing what I was doing. And then from there, you just do the work to prepare. And what's interesting is the work to prepare wasn't nearly as difficult as what you might think it would be. Mostly for the reason that I knew why I was doing what I was doing. And all of a sudden, it changes it changes the definition of difficulty, because difficulty is a relative word. And when you really want something, it's amazing how you'll go after it if you really want it. And you have an ability that's probably greater than you think if you really know why you're going after something.
Shari, how does that apply to your business? Tell us about your business.
I love the idea of finding the why. And one of the things that I talk about in my book is a concept you've probably heard before, but I've got possibly a different definition for it. And that's this whole idea of unconscious mastery. To me, winning and peak performance is knowing what you're doing, knowing your material, having practiced so much that you can go through the motions almost unconsciously. And the reason that's important is because if we're constantly thinking, particularly in a sales environment, okay, what are the 5 steps of overcoming an objection? You know, do I know how my technology works? If I'm focusing on the mechanics, I can't open my heart to the person that's in front of me or to the task that's in front of me. I can't pivot when things kind of go out of control. It's also anticipating what might come your way. And I think a lot of times salespeople, you know, they've got their sales presentation down, they've got their script down, they know what they're going to do, but they don't anticipate, as I'm sure a runner needs to do, but I'm not a runner, roadblocks that might come up. You know, what objections might the customer have? Oh my gosh, we have a new CMO. What's the CMO going to say? And am I anticipating objections, and am I anticipating needs? But I feel, Gerhard, like only if we truly know our material inside and out, only if we have that technical prowess, only if we know what we're supposed to do, can we truly connect. Truly thinking, putting yourself in the place of the customer and thinking, how can I add value to them? Maybe it's not as big of a deal the first time, but how do I deliver them value? How do I connect authentically? What do I need to do to really have empathy?
Well, there's another way to look at that. I remember Steven Spielberg giving a commencement address at Harvard.
And I want to be clear that your intuition is different from your conscience. They work in tandem, but here's the distinction. Your conscience shouts, here's what you should do, while your intuition whispers, here's what you could do. Listen to that voice that tells you what you could do.
I think when you speak of your heart, I think you also want to include intuition. What is that bubbles up from the inside? And everybody, I think, has inner magic. Bill McDermott made me aware of that in his book, where he writes about Winner's Dream. And he talks about his belief that everybody has inner magic. Everybody is wired differently, and everybody has some talent. So with Mike, the big talent is that he has a mind and body that's wired for endurance, and he prepared himself in a big freezer in San Diego to prepare for a race in Antarctica. So, Mike, can you speak to the heart of what Shari is saying? How does the heart fit into your scheme?
In a world of high tech, this and that, you know, we have apps that'll take us from here to Hong Kong in 3 seconds and give us an ROI of 12,492% in the first 17 seconds. And we forget that people still buy from those they like and trust. And I think people will drive further and spend more money to do business with somebody who's authentic. And I think that's the heartbeat of what Shari's talking about. And I think that in terms of how that translates into what I did in terms of preparing for, you know, really terrible conditions, I think it really came down to just knowing again why I was doing what I was doing. It was really an extension and reflection of who I was. I mean, what I did wasn't an act. It wasn't a sales pitch. It wasn't anything other than who Mike is. And the fact that it parlayed what I do into a career was sort of like an oh, by the way. It wasn't the primary driver. It was really who I was at the end of the day. And I think one of the compliments I've had when I speak is when somebody says to me, you know, the thing that was most powerful about your message was the fact that I can tell this is actually who you are 7 days a week. And that's true. And that's probably the highest compliment I think we can receive as business people. If somebody looks at you in the eye and says, I really sense this is who you are. And to Shari's earlier point, if you're just out pushing an agenda and pushing a number and pushing a product or a service, and you don't have a conviction about it, and you're not focused on the customer and the things that they really need, there's no way that conversation is going to be authentic. And I think that people can sense that from a long way away.
Mike, did you go to Antarctica to win the race, to beat everyone else, or to prove to yourself that you could do it?
For me, it was not about beating any other runner, and it was not about achieving a particular time. Quite frankly, my goal, Mark, was to get lost. There was a part of my thinking, honestly, that said, I hope I'm out there for 48 hours, stranded, without any sign of life. Because my goal in going down there was one focus: to walk in the shoes of my heroes who went there 100 years ago. So for me, it was like going into a time machine. So honestly, the longer I'm on the course, the more time in the time machine. It's like having a longer ride on the carnival.
So now stop and think about that. That's your heart and the authenticity of it.
That's exactly what it is.
We've been talking about the mechanics.
Right.
And if you think about it, so many times people and salespeople and I as a speaker, you can get caught up in the mechanics of doing something. But it's really until you connect. Stephen Covey said it really well. You know, how do we really listen? Are we listening or are we listening? And it's that ability to really have the authentic heart. And I'm going to kind of bring both of you together on this.
Yeah.
That I think allows the conversation to go to a deeper level, the whole outcome to go to a deeper level.
And I think it opens the door for the salesperson to look at the customer in the eye and say, listen, if my widget or my product or service doesn't fit what you need best, that's okay. The good news is I probably know the person who can help you. That's the best conversation you can have in a sales environment any day.
I find salespeople, right, you know, they want to tell you all the facts and the figures and how it works, but they either talk too much, or they're not connecting with the customer, or they best somebody. I love that one when a salesperson comes in and he's one-up man, you know, so he's emotionally incorrect. And at the end of the day, we know the way the brain works, people make emotional decisions. The heart always comes before the head. We know this.
Left brainers have a challenge, and you know, somebody just asked the question online here. You know, how do you coach a salesperson who lives in the left brain? Mark, what do you recommend?
Well, first of all, you got to get in. You got to be on their side of the brain. Shari raised a good point. You know, her son is intellectually gifted. Well, then you better speak to him in those terms. I mean, that's one of the biggest obstacles I think people face is when we fail to realize what language they speak in. No, what language do they think in? And that's the language we got to communicate in.
So you're saying that you got to teach salespeople the language of the brain and also the language of the heart.
That in turn gives you the mechanics to be able to authentically, emotionally connect with your heart, with the customer. Because at the end of the day, it's the outcome of the customer, not what we're selling. It's the outcome of the customer. That's the goal. That's the success we're looking for.
When you think about the whole issue of how do you get salespeople to focus from the mechanics into the issues that we're talking about, I'm going to use another Antarctic metaphor to illustrate this. And there's an interesting story behind it. And it happens to be this guy right here, who's the Emperor Penguin. And I'm going to allude to the movie, The March of the Penguins. And if you know much about that movie, you know that the Emperor Penguin is the only species, living species, that can survive in the harshest conditions in the world. And you ask yourself the question, how can those penguins survive? The answer is they are focused so much more on their mate and their chick than they are themselves. I was sitting there one day doing some work, and I get bombarded with emails, and I'm sure you guys all do too, especially on social media sites like LinkedIn, where you get these emails and these in-mails, people saying things like, here's my widget, here's my product and service, and it's going to change your life, and here's a brochure and all this other noise that you have no interest or need in. And you get frustrated. And I was so frustrated one day after these things just came pouring in like a river. And I said to myself, why can't these salespeople think and act more like the penguins? Why can't their focus be so much more on what I need and what on the prospective customers they're talking to, their needs are, instead of their own? Why can't they operate more like the penguins? I got so frustrated with that, I wrote a book. I called it The Penguin Principle. I literally wrote the book out of frustration. And I'm not here to promote a book. That's not why I'm telling you this. I'm here to promote the point of the story, which is focus on the other people like the penguins do. And that's how you get more than enough of what you want or need. And I think that if I'm a leader in a sales group and I've got a group of salespeople, I've got to teach these people how to do that. I've got to literally teach them how to have conversations with customers that say, let's get to the bottom of the barrel. Let's figure out what's keeping you up at night. And then we'll figure out whose widget solves the problem best. Because what's interesting is, let's take Shari as an example. Let's say she's a prospective customer. My widget, it doesn't solve her problem best. Mark Hunter's does. So I make the introduction right then and there, right on the phone. I'm sitting there going like this, and I'm introducing Mark to her as we speak. If I do that, Shari is going to tell a bazillion more people about me than if I had sold her the widget. And just because my widget worked, if it's not best, she's not going to tell nearly as many people. And we're just so focused on the widget sales that we forget to trust that if we have enough conversations with Shari and say, you need Gerhard's widget, you need Mark Hunter's widget, we'll sell more widgets than we can produce. And you have to trust that. And if you don't trust that, you might as well not even be in the sales profession.
I think you're speaking about empathy and having empathy for the customer. By the way, I'd love to be an emperor penguin and have the wife be the breadwinner and bring me a buffet like that.
I will share that with your wife, Gerhard. Okay.
No, it brings back an important point, which is that Herb Greenberg, he wrote an interesting article in Harvard Business Review a long time ago where he talks about empathy and talks about ego drive. And the ego drive is all about wanting to win the marathon in Antarctica, wanting to win that big sale. And salespeople that have a lot of ego drive, they're very hungry, and they often get to the close by pushing everything aside. But then there are salespeople who use empathy. And if you use too much empathy, then you use sympathy. And then you sympathize with the customer's objection that the price is too high. So Dr. Greenberg said, you want to balance empathy and ego drive. If you have too much ego drive, you're going to breeze through the sale, you get a cancel order the next day. If you don't have enough empathy, you're never going to ask for the close. Never close that sale. So you have to have a balance between empathy and ego drive and not bulldoze your way through the sale and not be a pushover.
See, I think we have to change our definition from winning being making the sale of my widget to the win being the customer got the correct widget. I think that's where the definition of win has to be adjusted. Because Gerhard, if at the end of the day, Shari's widget fits yours better than mine, and you got it, in my mind, you won. And that's all that counts. If you win, I win.
Is winning a destination or is winning a journey? Stop and think about it, Mike. You went down to Antarctica, 48 hours to get lost. That's a journey. That's a journey. And if you think about it, if we look at winning as a journey, I think we'll ultimately take those around us to a higher level because we're playing the long game. We get into trouble when we play the short game. We have to play the long game.
Mike, what you're exuding there is really faith. And I don't mean faith in a religious sense.
Correct.
Although it may be. I mean faith that there's enough to go around. And I think there's a lot of salespeople that have lack thoughts.
Yeah.
You know, I think that there's just only so much of a pie. And what I hear you saying is, hey, we got a pie factory in the world. And you just have to have faith that the more you put out, the more you'll get. And it's a very hard thing to teach. It's a spiritual thing. And I love that. And I think that when a salesperson has a leader such as yourself, that rubs off on them. And that's really beautiful. And then Mark, what you're saying is so poignant. I always am amused by salespeople or people in general who have the if onlys. You know, if only I had $1 million, then I'd be happy. You know, if only I was a manager, then I could do this. And it's sort of this, like, if only I had this, then I'd be happy. When everything we know about the brain, and Sean Anker talks about this in his TED Talk, is, no, you've got to flip the model.
What are the action steps? How do you keep yourself happy day after day after day? What do you do?
If I'm in a negative emotional state and I just engage in a random act of kindness, whether it's giving to a charity, whether it's, you know, helping somebody in need, it's amazing what happens to your emotional state when you are in a state of gratitude. Something I learned about, and I have this in my book, it's called default mode. There's a part of our brain called the default mode network. I mean, look, we're hardwired for survival, right? So our default mode is to go into fear. Our default mode is to go into distrust. So it actually takes effort to get out of this default mode, if you will, and to be in a positive emotional state. So if we're not thinking about it, we default, or we can default into these negative thoughts, as you call them. And I think we all have those tendencies. It's whether or not we're aware of those tendencies, and then we have a strategy to pull ourselves out.
Tell me more about your heroes. Was it Shackleton?
It was a number of them, including Ernest Shackleton, including Robert Scott, Roald Amundsen. There are several of these characters who were instrumental in putting Antarctica on the map for the first time 100 years ago.
And was there sort of a spiritual connection that you had with them?
No, the connection was simply this. The first time I read one of the stories was the Ernest Shackleton story. I picked it up in a bookstore in Bakersfield, California by random chance in August of 2001 while I was on a business trip. And my thought was this. Here's a guy who intentionally takes people into the middle of something called difficult and dangerous. It's somewhere in that zone. And I thought to myself, why would you do that? What type of mindset does it take to intentionally do this? And then, of course, as a former and recovering headhunter guy, because I spent 20 years as a people thief, that was my day job for 20 years, my thought was, how do you convince 27 other people to do this? But to me, it was a character issue that was really the magnetic draw. The character of somebody who was willing to take a risk and try something nobody's ever tried before. And as I stood there in the bookstore, I made the connection to the real world. I thought, you know, the best organizations in the world today do the exact same thing, right? They're taking risks. They're doing things nobody else is willing or able to do in their industry. And to do that is between difficult and dangerous. But I thought to myself, well, if they don't do this, why is a customer going to drive further and spend more money? Why is an employee going to stay at the company? I can tell you from 20 years of people thievery experience, if you're really a top performing person and you're not in that zone that's between difficult and dangerous, you're going to leave. You start banging your head on a ceiling, you're gone.
This is such an interesting discussion about the mechanics. If you think about it, the reason I think so many people bang their head on the top just as much because their boss is concerned about the mechanics. Leaders need to be focused on the people, not on the mechanics. And that's what shoots down. So I see so many salespeople going through the mechanics of just doing the job, and they wonder why they don't have the results because they're not connecting. Going back to what Shari said, the heart. What is the authenticity of the communication?
So the big question is, how do you create an organization where all members are optimized to achieve peak performance?
That's the elusive $1 million question that, quite frankly, if we had the answer, holy cow. I mean, the world would be a very different place. We'd be in a very different place ourselves.
Well, that's why Mark and I created that show around the peak performance mindset, because we want to help people to achieve optimal cognitive functioning and optimal psychological functioning, so that that, like Shari in her book, she knows the mechanics, but she also knows how to marry the mechanics with the heart. Shari, what is your takeaway and what is your message for our listeners? What to do next?
Oh, I've just lost my picture, but I think what they should do next is attend Selling Power 3.0 in Las Vegas and get a lot more from these great sales leaders.
Mark.
It really comes down to, are we emotionally, and come back to these key words we've been using, authentically connecting with people, with others. One of the things that I always say with each person I meet, I want to earn the right, the honor, the privilege, and respect to be able to meet with that person again. Mm-hmm. When I do that, what does that allow me to do? It allows me to move a little bit closer to helping them achieve their goals. And again, what is it all about? It's really helping them see and achieve what they didn't think was possible. When I do that, I mean, Mike, that's what Mike did when he ran this marathon for 8 days in Antarctica. I mean, I can hardly, like, whoa. And then wanting to stay there. Excuse me, that's a little demented. But you know what? That was an unbelievable achievement. And I take my hat off to him.
We can all be peak performers if we are authentic, if we define ourselves and find ourselves and express our best qualities, because everything you need to succeed is within you now. So we have that capability. Secondly, we want to focus on the why we are doing what we are doing, because the bigger the why, the bigger the try. And third, we need to get out of our way and push the ego aside and say, here is what we're going to do to help others win, because Zig Ziglar said it best: you can get anything in your life you want, providing you help enough other people get what they want. And I want to invite everybody to come to Sales 3.0 on September 18th and 19th. There's a link down there. And if you like this program, hit the like button and share it with your team. And tune in next week again at 2:30, where Mark Hunter and we run this program, Peak Performance Mindset. Mark, you got the last word.
Well, the last word is this: peak performance is what you want to achieve, and what you can achieve is far greater than what you'll ever realize. But you got to start. You got to start now.